Down here, things only get better with time. It's why we perfected the art of the scenic route, and why we also love a game that takes all day to play. It's why we know that when we welcome old friends again, everything that's great here will be even better. 'Cause whether it's a long walk, a long lunch, or a long-awaited hello, there's nothing like Australia.
Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to all of you for this session. My name is Rohit Manchanda, and I'm the Executive Council member at the Indo-Australian Chamber of Commerce. It is my pleasure to introduce this Agtech session titled Impact of Agritech and Innovations in Improving Farm Mechanization and Yield. Before moving forward, I would like to bring to your kind attention some housekeeping points for this session. In order to reduce background noise, all microphones will be muted during the webinar, apart from the person speaking. At the end of the session, the panel will be taking questions. Please use the questions section on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions. This session is being recorded. Recording will be made available to all participants. Lastly, the session is being streamed live on the Indo-Australian Chamber of Commerce's YouTube channel. Coming back to the topic of today's session, though India is one of the world's largest agricultural economies, its agribusiness is characterized by a multitude of fragmented supply chains. Agriculture in India is spread across 600,000 villages. Therefore, constant application of latest ideas to improve customized solutions to diverse needs of farming community is required. Enhancing farm mechanization is a key step towards better rural prosperity as well. In Australia, Agritech has significantly improved efficiency and productivity of animal and plant production systems. Australia's research in Agritech can be leveraged by India to improve productivity of its agricultural sector. Collaborations can be undertaken through knowledge sharing visits, technology transfer arrangements, a utilization of artificial intelligence, post-harvest management, and storage solutions. To discuss this further, we have an esteemed panel today to share their thoughts and wisdom with all of us. This session will be moderated by Mr. T.R. Kesavan, who is the Group President, Corporate Relations and Alliances at Tractors and Farm Equipment Limited, in short called TAFE. TAFE is the world's third largest tractor manufacturer and India's largest exporter of tractors, with a large portfolio of agricultural products and equipment. Mr. Kesavan is an engineering and management professional with over 47 years of national and international experience. He has a track record of 30 years in areas of agriculture productivity and management, government-industry interface, and public-private partnerships. Mr. Kesavan is also an external faculty for leading management schools. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you will have an engaging and fruitful discussion in this session. I will now hand over to Mr. Kesavan to introduce the panel and moderate the session. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Rohit, for the very nice words. Appreciate. That's one reason I sometimes join these sessions, to hear somebody talking good about you. It's good, isn't it? Okay. Before I start introducing people, I think I'm going to give a little background on what I think Rohit has already done it, but I'm going to add a little more to that to tell that what are we looking at today in this meeting. See, the topic is, and we have very eminent people like Dr. Ajit Ranganekar, DG Research and Innovation, T-Hub. We have Michael Reed, CEO of Skybase. We have David Davis, founder of CEO Agtech University, and Dr. Mike Barrier, AVO founder of Food Agility. I will introduce them when I really call on them for taking a particular topic. Before I do that, I want to talk about, I think Rohit mentioned about the importance of agriculture. See, I've seen two different areas of agriculture in Australia and in India. India, it's not that we have a shortage of food grains or anything. So sometimes I always ask people is what do we require productivity today or do we require to cut down the wastage? Considering the wastage can be anything between 24 to 40% depending upon you're talking about the grains or you're talking about fruits and vegetables. One of the things we always talk about it is productivity at the cost of soil and nature may not be a great thing to start with in India, but saving of wastage can actually mean you are got that much of productivity back into the system. 24 and 40% productivity is a great amount of productivity if we start wasting. So that is one area. Second is the need to reduce the input cost to the farmer, whether it is any item you're talking about, seeds, fertilizers, whatever it is, including water, power, and even maintaining the soil quality rather than damaging and reworking on the soil. Anything you can do to cut the input cost of the farmer can be a great boon. These are the areas, and I see there are two different things. Australia, large farms, they are maybe looking for productivity, genetic modified stuff. India, small farm, we have been always been little skeptical on genetic modified crops from the government point of view. The policy doesn't support it, but still, as I said, we have enough ways to actually increase the input to the farmer, the revenue to the farmer by cutting down the wastage at the input stage and also post production stage. There is also a great need of value addition. So I'm not going to limit this to only the mechanization because we talked about Agritech. So I'm going to take it into sorting, grading, processing, and seamless connection of input to supplies and farmers and markets. I'm talking about this because we have very relevant people in today's meeting talk about it. There is also a question of, see, it's all very easy to say transaction of money is still possible. The question is linking a transaction of money into physical movement of agricultural produce is actually has been a struggle even in India. So whatever the small time work you have been done, the question is how do I match this? How do I ensure that there is a traceability, there is a quality protection, and there is a transparency in the transaction? Third thing is data. Everybody talks about data. Indian government is working on a data retrieval policy. They are going to collect all the data and give it free to the people who really need it. The question is, farmers don't need data; they need a solution. So this is also going to be an important area. So I'm going to really touch upon the experts here to give me some input. I'm going to start my my thought process setting with Mr. Ajit Ranganekar. He has been the Director General of Research and Innovation Circle of Hyderabad, which is a Telangana government initiative. I know the Telangana government has been working quite bit on agricultural innovation. I've been working with a couple of Telangana universities, so I know what's happening there. Interestingly, he also headed the PSA supported by Hyderabad City Cluster Initiative, which is a collaborative network of research and academic institutions and industry startups. He retired as the Dean of Indian School of Business, the India's highest ranked business school. And he's the governing board of IITs and founder member of T-Hub. And, he's got extremely great education background. Like he's a graduate of IIT, did a post-graduation in IIM Ahmedabad. So I'm going to ask Mr. Ranganekar this question. Sir, I opened the topic saying that there is a need to Agritech. Now, in your opinion, what do you think that Australia, India can collaborate, knowing the amount of information you have on Indian agriculture, the way we do agriculture? I want to hear from you one or two points where you think that this is the right way to work together with Australia. Then I'm going to take that as a cue. I'm going to ask others on their inputs on the inputs you are given. Thank you. Over to Mr. Ajit.
Thank you, Mr. Kesavan, and thank you, Indo-Australia Chamber of Commerce. It's a delight to be here. So I think, what we see is that there is a lot of work happening. As you rightly said, we know the problems in India. The question is, how are we going about solving them? And today what we see is that there are, broadly speaking, 4 areas in which a lot of work is happening. The first is much better equipments for handling. Now, whether it's just for handling, for sowing, for watering, for spraying, or even for sorting, grading, etc., etc. But there is an enormous need because Indian agriculture, being small farms, really do not have the kind of equipment that is really needed. And obviously, TAFE, you people are big in that area, so you know that. The second thing that is happening is how do we improve the efficiency of the farm process through data and predominantly using AI. The third thing that is happening is again something that you touched upon is that how do we give greater market access, how do we do value addition, etc., etc. And then the fourth thing is within the actual farming itself, how do we improve yield scientifically, right, through gene editing. Now, in all of these, but certainly in the 3 out of these 4, there is enormous potential for collaboration. Equipment, for example, how do we have automation including small robots? How do we increase drone capacity? How do we do rapid soil produce testing, for example, etc.? These are all, then when it comes to efficiency, Australia has got crop planning models which are worth looking at. By the way, one big thing for India in efficiency is water usage. We are destroying water tables in our country, and I think we need to find ways of really efficiently and effectively not just using water, but deciding what kind of crops we should plant so that we don't unnecessarily end up wasting water. So there is enormous potential for that. In terms of market access, perhaps not too much because we are being very, very strong in e-commerce of all kinds, and rural e-commerce is something we have already done extremely well. But in the last one, which is the scientific improvement of yields, plant genomics, things like gene editing, things like breeding biofortified crops, rapid breeding. These are all things. And finally, the big thing is food processing, including meat industry. We in India somehow we give very little emphasis to the meat industry. Australia has done a phenomenal job in that area. So how can we collaborate in that area also? So just to start with, I thought I'll just lay 3-4 points of area where I think there is enormous potential for collaboration. And let me stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Ajit. I think you gave an opening statement. I think the best thing, what you said is that we know that we have a problem. That is probably the biggest step as far as the country is concerned. Then we really talked about efficiency. We talked about how do you go about connecting farmers and how do you use data and how do you really ensure the process industry adds on. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to go in an order. I'm going to go to Mr. Davis, founder of CEO Agritech University. Agritech University is a global technology platform empowering thousands of organizations working towards UN Sustainable Development Goals to connect the last mile. And Mr. Davis has been working on smartphone and operating system in a technology ecosystem that provides people living and working with the last mile. So I believe some of this thing can be very, very useful for India, especially on those points highlighted by Mr. Ranganekar. David also found and served as CEO of successful fintech. So he also has a little bit on the connectivity of financials and the end consumer. He has got a lot of experience in blockchain. That's another interesting area David can bring in. This is a question I always have. How much blockchain can help India in solving some of the problems highlighted by Mr. Ajit? And he has spent a decade in senior roles of global investment banks, Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, Nomura, and is a leading voice in the use of deployment of blockchain technically, internationally, and recently named Agripreneur of the Year at the Agro Challenge in Turkey. So I think we have the right person to give some thoughts how Australia and India work together in the areas highlighted by Mr. Ajit Ranganekar. Over to you, Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kassan. There was a lot. I really do appreciate the introduction. Just a little bit of colour. Ag Unity, we work in much more developing countries than India typically. Countries like Ethiopia and Papua New Guinea, where we're dealing with very developing world problems. As Mr. Ajit pointed out, that India has done very good work around things like identity with your Ajar program and about e-commerce, even to reaching out to the farmers. So we work often in countries that don't have anything like those things. We often provide farmers with a phone. That's usually the phone we provide, that simplifies what they can do, and it's designed that the phone can connect those farmers who've often never had a phone before to very simple things like giving them a digital identity, giving them access to markets. But the most important thing is a couple of topics that you, Mr. Kesavan, pointed on, because we see those a lot. Number one that you mentioned was the food wastage. In Papua New Guinea, we saw situations where the cocoa cooperatives, at least half of the commodity was going to waste due to the poor supply chain. Either the farmers would harvest it and just no one would turn up to buy it. They didn't have a right supply chain. That's a very, very simple problem, and I think that exists all over the world. We certainly see it everywhere, from Ethiopia to Guatemala to Papua New Guinea. Another point that you specifically raised that I thought was very important was input costs, because we work with particularly small farmers. Like, a lot of our farmers have only 1 or 2 acres of land, living on a couple of dollars a day. The big challenge with input costs is often about getting those farmers to work together collaboratively. If they can share equipment or they can buy bags of fertilizer together and share it, that reduces the costs of those things dramatically for those farmers. But usually the problem, or the reason that they fail to do that, is a lack of trust. And that, to your point, is where the blockchain can come in very well. I mean, we are not a fan of using the more elaborate, market trading, smart contracts aspects of the blockchain. We use it in a very, very simple way, just to ensure that when farmers do transactions to each other or to a cooperative, that there is a record that nobody can ever change. So if I'm a farmer and I hand my cocoa beans to the cooperative and they're going to pay me 2 weeks later, no one can ever say I didn't do that. And it seems a very simple thing, but sometimes the very simple things can have the most profound effect on income for the farmers. And this touches on a lot of the areas that Mr. Ajit spoke to. Efficiency through data is one of the things that we work on very heavily. We don't touch on many of the elaborate areas, but we find that first step of getting a platform that's simple into the hands of the farmers, that opens the path to be able to do a lot more things, like give the farmers advice on crop selection, give them access to sharing equipment that they don't have to buy themselves. So those are the things we typically work on with our solution.
Thank you, Dave. I think it's very interesting the way you said it, because I too believe what you read in India also, we require small interventions where the farmers can accept it. You can't trust anything onto the farmer with something we notice. So they need to accept. I just give you one example that we did the CSR program across, that any farmer who has got a tractor can lend it to any farmer who does not have a tractor. And we don't make money out of it. It is completely CSR basis. And today we have 2.5 million farmers on it. And they probably have earned a lot of money. But the entire thing was done, as you very rightly said, a simple mobile app. But even to get it moving, I had to start with feet on the ground, call centers, and then slowly they graduated and understand that this can be done. It's a slow exercise, but farmers catch on if they find there is benefit. Great stuff, David. I think the interesting point you said, and another interesting point really came out, I think I also talked about this, is the question of food wastage. And how do we actually avoid that food wastage is another area. Now, I'm going to go into one more gentleman who is on the food agility. So I'm going to go to Dr. Mike Ferriers on the food agility part. Dr. Mike Ferriers, AO, founder of Food Agility. Mike was named in the Knowledge Nation 100 as Australia's chief evangelist of big data and Internet of Things, and appointed Australia's first industry professor of IoT and UTS. He was the founding CEO of Food Agility CRC, a 150 million innovation hub with 30 private sectors, government research partners. He is translating his pioneering work in fintech and big data to catalyze the digital transformation. Mike is a co-founder and the director of Australian Agritech Association and Internet of Things Alliance of Australia. He is founder of big data company Rosetta, where commercializes data services. Mike is co-founder of Capital Markets ERC and startups. And he was recognized in 2016 the Queen's Birthday Honours and was appointed the officer of the General Division of Order of Australia. Mr. Mike Breers, I want to tell you that Indian agriculture startup is also a big play. I mean, we have been seeing a lot of startups coming in the agricultural area. You heard two of our people talking, Mr. Ajit and David Davis talking, and we actually laid out certain issues in front, including the food security, including knowing the problem, how to get a solution. Davis touched upon blockchain, and Ajit came out and said, look, these are the areas we can work on, like rapid breeding, meat industry, food processing, etc. Knowing that you are from food and you have the IoT and other background, big data background, how do you think Australia and India can work towards resolving some of these issues? Dr. Mike Breers. Sir, you're not audible.
Yep, there you go. Thank you, Mr. Kesman, and apologise for that rather long introduction. Yeah, look, at the moment, my current effort and role is in actually this establishment and bringing focus to the Agritech industry in Australia through the Australian Agritech Association. And so what I'm seeing there and lessons learned. So I guess I've got a favourite saying that I used to roll out when I'd sort of been a bit like David. Spent many years in a much more mature sector in finance from a data perspective, and so my ambition is to take some of the lessons that we learnt from more mature sectors into less mature sectors like agriculture from a data perspective. And one of the things I really like to say is that, and it's a quote, and I forget who said this first, but it was something like, the future is now, it is just unevenly distributed. In other words, the future is happening somewhere in the world, because they've got a certain innovation environment, they've got a certain other types of environmental conditions, they've got certain policies and other regulatory things that enable certain things to happen more quickly than in other places. At the moment, when we look at the advent of the Internet of Things, I think that sitting alongside of agriculture is the next big thing, and it is. We're seeing sensing become much more cheaper. We're in rural and remote areas. We're able to get energy and more and more connectivity to those devices. We've got obviously more powerful remote sensing from satellites that can zoom down to 1 inch on the Earth, and we also have robotics and tractors and sophisticated equipment that in some way or another all collect data. And this is what I call a measurement system. There's a system out there that's getting more sophisticated, getting cheaper, and importantly, getting more reliable. And of course, the step to AI and predictive analytics really depends on that reliability. So we can't start talking about AI until you've got that measurement system in place that reliably measures information, sends that data to an algorithm or algorithms, and then that algorithm helps someone make a decision or automatically makes a decision for you. And that's really important. That sort of we've discovered, that I learned, I guess, in financial markets, but also in agriculture becoming more important. But some of the businesses and some of the agribusinesses that are going faster now are focusing on that, on getting those fundamentals right. And then you see across the world, the spectrum of agricultural produce, all the way from livestock track and traceability to fish to horticulture to broadacre cropping, etc. These all have completely different environments and really demand that the technology providers really understand intimately. And I think we've come out of that place where we've had a lot of technology vendors that are trying to sell things into agriculture, and that hasn't worked. And farmers have had pretty bad experiences of that in many cases. And so there's a trust issue in terms of, and so what we're seeing now is much more in the entrepreneurial in the startup space, where there's actually farmers and ex-farmers who understand the problems and challenges of farming to actually start their own technology startup. So it's really we're in a really interesting space here in Australia, and I guess my message here is coming back to that. The future is now, and it's just unevenly distributed. Is what can we learn? What can and I know the context is completely different in India. Obviously, preponderance of smallholder farmers. You've got actually right now, as I understand in your country, some sensitivities around aggregation of farms. But the reality is, in testing some of this technology, is that the bigger players can afford to invest in the underpinning sort of infrastructure that's needed, but that'll get cheaper. And so I guess there's a lesson there about what and it includes things like disease prediction, yield prediction. We're now getting, for example, in blueberries and grapes for some big agribusinesses in Australia, artificial intelligence, for example, that's predicting better than the best human can. From the point of view of supply chain resilience and reliability, those sorts of things are becoming really super important. I guess the other thing I would say is, and look, I certainly know David Davies, and I know his work in those smallholder farms, and I would say that where he is really certainly at the cutting edge of how we practically mobilise and engage with smallholder farms. But one of the things that I learned on a work with the Gates Foundation in Ethiopia with, again, many smallholder farms, is the importance of the service providers. And I just wanted to raise this as a point. And I'm saying the agronomers and the veterinarians. So how do you get out to these small farmers? Because one of the biggest barriers to adoption is education. And any vendor of technology wants a better educated market, a more sophisticated market. So how can we better educate our farmers to make better choices about technology, understand how they would get a return on investment from that technology, understand how this technology might help them get a better valuation from their farm. How can this technology help them build and plan to be more resilient against climate change, pandemics, etc., etc. So one of the things I'm particularly passionate about at the moment is I'm leading a charge here in Australia around developing a sort of a new, almost a credential for agronomists and veterinarians to upskill them in technology, so that they can actually help those farmers make better decisions as one method. And I've probably already said too much, but I'll leave it for other questions now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I think from Dr. Mike, I think that has been a good, how do I say, I think you've covered a lot with respect to the developing countries. I think India has probably moved a lot out of the developing country problems because the kind of technology and things available, but using it to crack agriculture is still a question. You even pointed out the sensitive aggregation of land in the farmers in India. See, the problem here is the only, let us say, property which the farmer can talk about ever is his land in India. So he doesn't want to give it up. But that's changing. It's changing because of the new FPOs. Willingness to work together without giving up the land has been the sort of a solution being found out, and is slowly catching on. The second thing which you talked about is IoT and the future and the ability of the satellites to map and understand what is happening. Now, I'm going to come to this because I'm going to talk on this particular area because he seems to be an expert on the aviation and drones, etc. But one thing I wanted to really tell you that we have been working in Ethiopia creating an experimental farm. And we found that exactly what you told me is what's really been our problem. And I did work a little bit with the Clinton Foundation in a couple of other parts of Africa. But then again, I found that, the trouble is many of the larger foundations look for incremental growth over a large number of farmers. Whereas in agriculture, I prefer to have a much more deep-rooted growth on a smaller number of farmers because that you are able to replicate, add value. I think this is sort of a problem I've always been facing, including Ethiopia. I'd love to talk to you on this separately. Now, coming back to the ability of satellites. See, one of the areas we have been noticing that India definitely requires satellite information, which the government itself is willing to provide because they are really looking for big data coming out of satellite, data coming in, and which will be much more macro. But Indian farmers, when we talk to them, they are really looking for micro. They are more worried about their land, their area, rather than they are not too much worried about the macro data. So I'm going to go back and ask this because I know that he has done quite a bit of work on the avionics and other areas. I'm really trying to find out to Mr. Michael Reed, CEO of Skybase. Michael loves building a vision and building teams to create a new reality. By studying and refining the formulas for startup success the last decade, Mr. Mike combined an aviation career, spanning over 20 years in a manned and unmanned optionally piloted aviation across military, civilian, humanitarian, experimental test flying operation. Michael is enjoying leading the growth of Skybase. He has informed and precise approach to product design, navigating complex regulatory environments. He is a veteran, having served in multiple operational pilot in the Royal Australian Air Force. So my question to Mr. Michael will be, Michael, actually one of the areas where India is definitely looking into is not the macro. I said, keep the satellites. I'm looking into drones. I'm looking into those kind of areas. There are regulatory issues which we hope will be solved. And I want your opinion because your opinion on utilization of this kind of devices in a country like India, a developing country, and how do you think that we can collaborate with Australia? One of the areas we notice in a drone are a couple of things. Our problem is one is the ability of how much is the load it can carry. Number one, payload, and then ability to handle liquid and granular things. The third most important thing is the life of the battery. So nowadays we tend to opt for a petrol-driven one with the electric with the battery backup, so that you get a much larger distances on drones. And here we're not really worried about completely autonomous drones because we have enough people to really manage the drones. So it's not autonomous thing we are looking at. We are looking at something, a man-drone interface which can work very well for India. So over to you, Mr. Michael Reed.
Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction there, Mr. Kesavan. That's very spot on. I thoroughly enjoyed Mike Breyer's input there on where mapping is at the moment. Obviously, you've touched on a couple of key points as well about payload and range and what you can do with a drone. Over the last, I'd say, 5 years, there's been a lot of hype around drone technology, and that's everyone thinking that drones can save the world and be the silver bullet that to every situation. But based on my experience both operating small unmanned aircraft and very large aeroplanes and everything in between, from fast jets to helicopters and transport aircraft and you name it, what I've learned is the fact that if you try to get the wrong aircraft to do a particular job, you end up costing yourself a lot of time and money and resource, which is otherwise wasted. So there's definitely a place for drone technology. It's akin to, I guess, using a scalpel. A surgeon needs a scalpel, but if you're going to use it on a building site, you're not going to build a building with a scalpel, you need a bulldozer. And that's where the difference between, I guess, a drone and an aeroplane. And there's been a fundamental misunderstanding in the industry and a lot of, as I mentioned, hype around effectively trying to turn drones into aeroplanes. And so we pivoted away from drone technology a couple of years ago to effectively turn aeroplanes into drones, or optionally piloted aeroplanes. And that fundamentally came down to the issue of payload and range. Drones, arguably the best drone in the market for doing aerial mapping of, say, a farm up to 500 hectares is a small drone from Germany. It's absolutely excellent. We've got a lot of experience using it. It's out of the box, but it's not going to do any more than that. As soon as you want to go to a large area and talking about farm aggregation, talking about thousands of hectares, you need aeroplanes for that. And particularly when it comes to, as you mentioned, using it for spray or dispensing of dry material for top dressing as well. And I'm sure many of you are aware of what's happening with the locust plague at the moment, which is happening all around the world. And so we've got that actually as our very narrow focus at the moment. Whilst we can use our aeroplanes for aerial mapping day or night, and using our aeroplanes to spray locusts at night when they're on the ground, because they don't fly around, is much, much better. And all of the things that have been talked about with those incremental improvements in improving agricultural yield, they get blown out of the water. As soon as a locust plague shows up, all of that work is for nothing. So we, I guess, have narrowed our direction as opposed to offering a technology product. We are now offering effectively a service and looking at offering that in countries such as true developing countries, particularly in East Africa, which has been hit very hard, but also in India, which is obviously a step beyond that. But there are some, I guess, more operational challenges in the bigger the country and the more mountainous it is. So looking at, I guess, what you can do with an aeroplane versus a satellite, is touching on that mapping. Mike mentioned, you can get down to inch level resolution on a satellite image. But that's extremely expensive from a satellite. And typically speaking, anything less than about 10 centimetres is restricted to military. And so most sampling distance that you can get from a satellite is around 50 centimetres, whereas an aeroplane, which can fly over whenever you want it, you can get down to a sub 2 centimetres resolution to get that. And what that means is you've got much higher quality data over arguably a smaller area, but it means that when you're running your AI over that, you obviously get better results, because it's good quality data in means good quality results out. So it's all about finding the right tool for the job, and that's where I guess we fit in, and not trying to sell technology, but working with the agricultural industry, because most farmers don't have their own aeroplanes. It's all done through service provision. So I thought I'd try and sort of wrap up at some of the key points that some of the other speakers have spoken about there, as well as some of your points, Mr. Kesavan.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I think, yes, I noticed that there is definitely a different way in which the countries like Australia will look at it, and the countries like India will look at it. See, we have a lot of restrictions with respect to flying aircrafts for spraying. Huge amount of restrictions, and also because we also have a serious problem with the border areas. And if you notice that many of the locust infection in India actually started from the border areas. And last time what we really did was we used a swarm of drones to tackle it. So I get a feeling we will definitely use a slightly different version considering our issues. And second thing is when we talked about farmers in India, mapping those small farms with drones and giving them a regular advice is a possibility. But I'm going to look at drones as a service in India. And we are also looking at drones as swarm services in India. One example I like to share is a plantation, which is more or less it's already mapped for years, so that things doesn't change that much. So we have done it, we're trying to do large experiments in tea plantations, and that actually is actually helping us. And the other areas would be all the plantations where the plantation remains as it is for 30, 40 years. So that is another area we are looking at drones after canopy, cropping the canopy, etc. Everything. So it's definitely a lot of things is happening in India. A lot of drone companies are coming in, though their initial dependence in drones have been with the Chinese component. So, but the government is giving a huge thrust on getting those components made in India. So I get a feeling in 2 years' time, you'll find a huge difference with respect to the way the drones are going in India. I don't think aircraft will be the option India will take. And that's one thing is coming more and more clear. Now, coming to this, I'm going to again go back to Davis on the Agritech University, because I really talked about the drones. And one area I'm going to give you an example. See, the traceability, especially where we are dealing with national market is one, but when I'm dealing with international market, gives me a huge amount of return. One example, we do tea gardens and we could get $400 for a pound of tea in the last auction. It is organic, it is completely traceable, it can go back to years, and suddenly you find that the same land which used to give me some $20, $30, $40, $50 a pound is suddenly will be able to give me $400 pounds for a kilo of the produce. So the question here is, traceability, I think, is going to change not only in the world, but can going to be very important from India. So this is one area I really want to talk to you on, Davis, that what do you think, where do we think we can actually work with Australia so that we can improve our traceability so that farmers and the business, agribusiness, gets better returns? Davis.
So I actually have a different anecdote that's relevant to that. So I used to live in Japan for 12 years, and anyone else that's lived in Japan would be aware that even in the very small supermarkets, they'll take things like, peaches or apples, and they'll segregate them according to the farmer. And they'll actually have a little note under the apples saying, this is, farmer Xingtao in this area, he grew these apples, this is the care he took. And it works there because their culture has been very accustomed to knowing the origin of fruit products, and they'll pay a lot for certain commodities. So there's the economics that make sense of it. So we see there's a very big opportunity for both Australian and Indian markets to provide that level of traceability in Japan. And a couple of years ago, when we were founding a different company, we were in discussions with, I think, the 3 largest retail chains in Japan, who all thought that was the holy grail. Like, if we could see that our mangoes in Australia came from a specific farm and they were fresh all the way, they would pay a much higher price. I believe Korea also has a very similar dynamics in their market, and they will aptly pay more for products. Flip that round to another angle. We work with a lot of coffee, cacao, and vanilla. These are really depressed markets, and farmers get very low amounts of value, somewhere around 3 to 5% of what a consumer in a developed market would pay for those projects. I think tea is not too dissimilar as well. We have situations where chocolatiers in Canberra, for instance, are paying $13 instead of $2 for cacao, so 6.5 times the price, because they've got good traceability on that cacao from a particular farm in Bougainville, Papua New Guinea. And so they've obviously got consumers that are willing to actually pay the added price. The challenge is doing that traceability is really hard out of a developed market, because you're often collecting commodities from a farmer where they have no digitisation. The traceability sometimes occurs at a consolidator level, and that's not really telling you whether it was from a sustainable farm, whether that farm got a living income. One of the very troubling things that we've learnt about recently is, for example, a lot of coffee brands are moving away from the good organisations that do certify origin and can potentially provide some degree of traceability, and they're just certifying their own brand. Like, they're literally a label on their own coffee that says this is sustainably sourced and environmentally friendly, and they do nothing about it. They've literally just stuck a label on it that's a pure lie. And I'm not going to name the companies, but there's quite a few that are doing that. And I think the way to address that, and I think this is very important for markets like India that produce large quantities of tea, for example, is to provide that end-to-end traceability to consumers, and then also incentivize the consumers to look at that information. So we're working on a couple of projects to do exactly that at the moment, and I think that is going to be a game changer. When you go into your coffee shop in Germany and you scan the QR code on your receipt and you see the actual farmer that grew your coffee, and you say, oh, what a nice guy, and I'm going to send him €1 tip. And then the farmer can say thank you right back to him. That will change the dynamic. Until we get to that level, it's still a little bit unclear to consumers what the difference is. But I think once consumers connect to that farmer and they realise that that tip really mattered and the farmer is really being helped because they're buying an ethical brand, we'll start to see the developed companies' consumer behaviour change. And that's the key to this. But there's a very, very big project and a lot of groundwork we have to do to get there.
Thank you, David. Actually, I'm not even thinking of going right up to the consumer. I'm just thinking the farmers to the bulk buyer in India, where the traceability is becoming extremely important. Because today, one fellow will be sitting some 3,000 kilometers away from where he's going to buy it. And we are trying to avoid the middlemen. That's the whole ball game in this. Because middlemen make a lot of money. That money can very well go to the farmer or to the end consumer. So considering that traceability is becoming a big, important initiative in India. And what we are trying to do is we are going to make it farmer to the bulk buyer to start with. That is the first thing we are looking at. So considering this, I'm going back to Mr. Ajit Ranganekar, because he has been so much involved in the Indian agri system and innovations. And I see a lot of people coming out with the traceability model as a first step, as I said, from the seller to the primary buyer. Because it has got 2-3 steps. One is, what is the condition traceability when he sells it? Then later somebody like to have a traceability during the shipment and receipt. So that gives the totality. Quality and traceability is a link. So, Mr. Ajit Ranganekar, your thoughts on it, please.
Thank you. We are seeing many companies now in that space who are actually looking at. But I think Mr. Davis raised a very interesting and very valid point. Who ultimately are we going to rely on somebody whose own credentials are in doubt on an important enough certification? And whether there is a potential for a credible certifying organization who can do it. Technically, today we can do it. There is no problem about it. There are sufficient number of startups who are now doing it. There is, as everyone now puts in, some kind of blockchain into it and says, it's all blockchain and everything. Most of it is gimmicky, but be that as it may. If at the end of it, it's just a certificate, it has very limited value. So I think for us also having a credible organization which can genuinely be relied upon is actually the real problem. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think I really go back to the way when we initiated the ISI certification for even industrial product. And Sajid is nodding his head quite well. See, that was our problem. How do we ensure that that certification means something at the end of the day? Okay. Yeah. Yes. Now, one of the things we are trying to move is also a certification for produce. Okay. Now, this is much more difficult than a product so this is another thing we have been noticing it. And second is certification. Second is that does that fellow really meet the certification standards, or because nobody's going to check it every time. So these are the two worries, Mr. Ajit. I think I'm fully with you on that particular thing. I think we have about 10 minutes left, if I think. Now, I wanted to ask, is there any questions for the speakers coming in? Because I don't really see question and answer. Let me just check up. Any Q&As?
So I had a question, if I may, till you look for those. So, one of the things that worries me, not worries, but certainly we need it, is data standardization. We are now digitizing away to glory, and every startup has its own way of identifying data, etc. And we need a global standard. Because if you are all exporting to Japan or to Europe or to wherever, I can't have a different standard from an Australian. And I'm wondering whether there is potential for us to collaborate on, Australia perhaps has it, and there is perhaps enough happening globally. Our challenge, of course, is going to be how do we adapt to that. But that is, as we go into this entire species of digital listing, we must first ensure there is adequate data standardization. And I don't think that has really happened.
Thank you, Ajit. I think, in fact, I am a part and parcel of the United Nations with respect to automotive data standards. While the whole world talks about standardizing, I only ask one question. What have you done for electrical plug across the world? I have to carry 5 of them. So that's a problem. I mean, every country has its own issue. But let me ask our learned people on the other side of Australia, have you found anything on the food, global standards on the food, something like getting moved across the world is one question. Second thing, just to add to Mr. Ajit, is, see, we have another issue. Every state in India creates data on food in a different platform, and integration at the center is becoming difficult. Now, NIC is working on one single way of coding it and data collection and uniqueness of the data. And so that's something even in India is a problem between state to state and center. So I'm going to ask this question to, I don't know who can take this, whoever think that between David Davies and Mike Berry, as you think that you can take the answer this question, I'll be happy to hear. I'm sure Ajit will be very happy to hear.
It's Mike. Look, I'm not sure that I've got the answer. It's an age-old problem, and all I know is that in our sector, interoperability is a massive issue, and there are some startups that are just focusing on making one piece of equipment talk to another piece, for example, and in another part of my world, which is the Internet of Things world, and the association there's a lot of effort and work going into sort of trying to standardize data, particular types of data. So one of the bigger questions to ask is what data, there's existing data, there's weather data, there's remote sensing data, et cetera, that's publicly available and can be standardized probably more easily. But there are other data, there's even new types of data. And so that's always the challenge. So I just wanted to highlight that is a common thing, I'm sure, that the two countries have, that interoperability one. And to the extent that we could join up and share experiences and some of our sounds to me like a productive conversation we could have. The second thing I wanted to say, I just wanted to go back to the, I don't want to keep using the word blockchain, but it's really about trust, isn't it? And the problem, but it's more, the thing is that, what are the credentials? Can I trust these credentials? Has it certain calorific or nutritional qualities? Where's it from, and so on. So some of the things that we've learned through food agility now in working with the corporate and the farming sector and the research sector is around trying to understand what a consumer actually, what's valuable to know. So you can actually have all the data collection you like, which tends to be expensive sometimes, but what specific data is the consumer interested in? So one of our examples is in meat into China. and the project team went to a lot of trouble to try and identify different grades, qualities of the meat, etc., etc. Even attached little video links to the kids at the local school near where the animals were bred, telling stories about their town. And what it turned out was that actually, well, that's sort of interesting, but it's not. All I really want to know is that it comes from Australia. There's only one thing, because of the food substitution issue, which is another issue right around authentication, and particularly for an exporting country like Australia, where our brand and our food gets, sometimes counterfeited, and so that's sort of interesting. I just want to add that dimension to that conversation we had with David as well around what's important. But that's a very common thing. It's very super common, right? So we've got a rice project where it's about trying to identify which type of what are the agronomic properties and farming practices that enable a rice to stay whole when it's milled. And of course, when the rice is harvested, it goes into the millet, into the milling factory, and it's all put in together. So there's really practical things about separation of grain, how batch control. It's as much about logistics and so on as well. So these problems are many faceted, and I can tell you that there's some of them. There's some big challenges here. I think that putting Australia together with India, we would have some very common challenges that we would be able to solve.
Thank you, Dr. Mike. I think you well said. I know the issue. And I also go back to David's thoughts at how the Japanese manage it. Because I've seen one of the things the Japanese, if you have to get a certification for organic tea in Japanese, it is 11 years and they test it every time. And then later what really happens is once the buyer and seller starts a relationship, that confidence comes in and still they test it, but then the trust starts building up. I think my feeling is the most important thing is as a country, you must be recognized that quality based supplier for everything. That's the first step to raise it up. And I think that's going to be the challenge for many developing countries, even people like us. I mean, to get that kind of a thing developed is a question and we need to understand. Very important aspect. The second thing which I notice whenever you talk about this kind of thing is any amount of technology can be useful only if the data what you put in is the right data. I mean, everything cannot be automated. Everything cannot be. So there are issues, but I think these are the issues we will overcome. So as somebody said, the only way to eat an elephant is to take the first bite. The small bite can change life. So anyway, coming back, I think we are almost running to our time of 1 hour, more or less. And if the organizations permit, I think I need to first of all thank every one of you for sharing your knowledge and spending your valuable time helping us to put these points together. And one thing I suggest we need to do on a long-term basis is considering that we have now connected and all of us have enough stake in the agricultural world and the innovation world. I think we should try to remain connected and we will see whether we can take this forward. So I will request any of you, all of us have our own email IDs with us. I will also augment it with the WhatsApp because that seems to be the easiest way to connect. And let us see whether all the knowledge put together, can we do something together for Australia, India, and that can be very, very interesting. If we can do that, maybe you need to really create a small forum for it, which I will definitely talk to the Indo-Australian people to see how we can build it up. I also work very, very closely with the Australian food people in India. We till now we had Dr. Nora. She's gone back to Canberra, and now we have James here. So I'm going to touch base with him and say, hey James, how do you think we can really make this work as a group, as a team for agriculture? And I sure that I'll be able to count on each one of you to be part of it, and something we can do can be a great thing for both the countries. And I think with that, I think I'm planning to close this unless I have to, I don't know whether to hand this back to the, otherwise I think we are just on time. And let me once again thank all of you and thank you for joining this session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
I'd love to continue to be involved too. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch. Thank you.